that we were playing before. Good evening. It's nice to see people go out on a Friday night in the cause of architecture. Peter Cook, I think fortunate for us, comes to SCI-Arc once a year. And I think what he does in a period of a week is, I think, really quite indicative of what he's been doing over the last 25 years, which is, I think, inspiring people to be enthusiastic about architecture. And I think getting people to do things that surprise them that they're capable of doing. In all the years that I've known him, or knowing his work, I've known him personally, perhaps for the last 5-6 years. I've always believed that the work that he started doing many years ago in England was some of the most influential work that's been done and really transformed the whole landscape of architecture. Many of the things that are being talked about again, I think, began 25 years ago with the Archogram group. I think a lot of the resurrection of the interest in technology began back then. The other side of Peter, I think, is I think many people would concur with, is he's sort of a legendary teacher. I think he's approached architecture in that way. I think he's always had an interest in conveying the world that he knows and the world that he sees to everybody else. And he does it in a way that is almost a self-revelation, as if you've discovered it for yourself, as opposed to him telling you about it, which I think is really quite an extraordinary ability. It takes quite exceptional skill and immense self-confidence to be willing to do it in that manner. This week, I think, it was once again a lot of fun having him here, and with his students and his associate Pascal Schoening, with the support of Hazel, his wife. It was nice to have all of his students show up just before the final push that our students undertake before the end of the semester, sort of re-energizing, like a shot of adrenaline. Personally, I'm always quite pleased when he comes because of the sort of symbolic value it has for him being here, supporting the cause of SCI-Arc. This evening, he's going to, I guess, show you his work and this and that, as he might say. Well, here he is, Peter Cook.
That was a nice introduction. You get hilarious introductions sometimes. That was a nice one. That was flattering and, good at the end of an academic week. Could I have the lights down, please, and the first 2 slides on? This is, by and large, talking about my own work. And do I have to have those on? I know you're videoing. Can you? Do you have to have them on? Better and better and better. You know what I look like. And it's all to do with sort of sideways thoughts. I think some of you may have seen a lot of this material before, not all of it, I know. But what I want to do principally this evening is to make some sort of aside to it, rather than necessarily blow-by-blow description. There is time for blow-by-blow anyway. But I want to make a side to it, because I think one of the things that increasingly amuses me about architecture is the myriad of interpretations that can be made to the same work, even if it's one's own, and the myriad of different interpretations one can make over time. And certainly, if I look at the Archogram work, it's really like looking as an art historian upon the work of other people. I can even almost quite dispassionately discuss the pros and cons of it, and the antecedents and the possible antecedents and all the rest of it. It's probably bullshit, because I think most of architecture is bullshit anyway, and it's marvelous. I really believe that. I think that most of the worthwhile things in life are really bullshit, and one can be creative about that. And it was amusing this afternoon in a jury that one of your colleagues here questioned the architecturalness of a certain project. And I think I know what he was getting at from his own position. And then I thought to myself, well, it's all architectural or none of it's architectural. It depends whether what bullshit you can invent together and compound together to form architecture. And I will explain that with a couple of examples immediately, from one from slightly earlier experience and one from recent experience. Those of you who know us well and look at labels on luggage will know that we came to Los Angeles from London via Iceland. It's a useful way to come, particularly if somebody's picking up the tab to do a lecture in Reykjavik. And you take yourself with you. I'm fascinated by taking oneself with one. And I used to say, as a child, one thought, Iceland, the land of ice, it's obviously full of snow and igloos. And then, as you became a slightly more sophisticated architectural animal, and you actually met real Icelanders, always with pale faces, and they said things such as, we're on the Gulf Stream, and of course you do get snow, of course, but we have quite a really almost temperate climate. No trees, few dogs, but quite a temperate climate. And yet one still had this sort of inkling that really it was snow and igloos, and kind of, people would jump out. Now, I can prove it. I was right all along. We landed in the worst blizzard I've ever known. The plane literally skidded its way through this blizzard. You could see about 3 meters in front of your hand. The next day, the sun shone. But sure, there we have it, snow and an igloo. I knew I was right all along. The fact that it's a concrete igloo and it's inhabited by a couple of sort of gay intellectuals with a Mercedes-Benz is by the way. And you can deduce what you like from that about Icelandic culture, the small population or whatever it might be. But in fact, igloos do exist there, and they are white, and there is snow. So one's childhood view of the thing wasn't so far off point. Now, of course, on the other hand, there is the induced view of architecture, which is not the childhood view of things. It is perhaps as a child, one thought that, building, why was I enthusiastic to become an architect from the age of 8? Because I thought you could do all sorts of things with architecture. It could be marvelous bullshit. It could go on playing with toys until late middle age. But of course, architecture, 7 years of expensive architectural training put rather a lot of that out of the window. It told you that in fact buildings were very four square things, and you have windows that you look out of, and you enunciate these, and you have tops and sides and bottoms and spandrel panels and things like that. Until you go to Japan. And you go to Japan, and there's that red thing going up there. It starts off life as a spandrel panel, and then it goes up into the sky. And suddenly, your 7 years of expensive architectural training are rather knocked on the head, aren't they? You look at the building on the right, and you say, well, yes, of course, I have 7 years. I was taught that buildings have tops and sides, and they have, commodity, firmness, and delight, and all the rest of it. But in fact, if you look carefully at that building, you can't really tell what is the top. Is the top of the tarpaulin? Or is it the top of the concrete frame? Or is it at the top of the articulated part, which anyhow is going to be booted out of the window the next year? So it's quite nice that, in a sense, one's childish instincts, I can prove with these two slides. Number one, one's childish instincts about, Iceland and igloos. Number two, one's childish instincts, which that there aren't all those bullshitty rules about what correct things to do with architecture, are there? 2 slides to prove it. Next, please. And so it is little wonder that at a certain key point in one's development, not only did one on the one hand spend a lot of time designing a building with some strange pieces of composition, but actually if you look hard at it, it's well bedded into the traditions of architecture. It has its its consistent systems, it has its hierarchies of parts, it does a few wobblies and makes them out of different things from what was hitherto normal, but it is an architectural piece. Nonetheless, at the same time as taking it extremely seriously and spending weeks and weeks and weeks designing it, one then published it in a throwaway manner. One said, you know, we believe firmly and dearly in this sort of architecture, but by the way, there's a pop-up book to illustrate it. And I think that was a phrase that when we had the Archigram group going, we used to use repeatedly, which was, this'll upset them. We never said who them were. We damn well knew who them were. But the important creative instinct was to upset them. And I think that is a sort of curious one to come back over 20 years later, which is the sort of cussedness of inspiration. I think that one isn't, in the end, a very nice person. A lot of the things one does are with a sort of vicious wish to upset them. And I think some of the best buildings are done with a wish to upset them. And some of the best offices are where there are the most insistent people insisting upon a certain sort of architecture. I don't believe in democracy in architecture. I really do not. I think it's a great problem that you have as a culture, which is that you want to be democratic. It gets in the way. But by the way, I think in architecture, the only good buildings are produced by rather demonic people, perhaps with one friend who they're prepared to do. And this will upset them is still something which is not a bad starting point. I know you can disagree with this, but more and more I feel that. Next. And perhaps those instincts were there for Mr. Leo on the right, and at an earlier point, Mr. Chernikhov on the left. What I'm also fascinated are things that come out of the closet, and when they come out, and what happens then. The drawing on the left, which is from Chernikhov's 101 Fantasies, used to exist for me and a few friends in a book that we had to get by asking for a key of a cupboard. The librarian at the Architectural Association in London in the 60s, early 70s, had this one old Russian book in Russian with the original coloration, which process architecture gets wrong, by the way, in the reproduction. And you asked for the key, and you take it out, and the leaves almost fell out of the book, and you felt you were suddenly shown a precious thing. And we used to gloat over this 101 Fantasies. Curious, and then of course the rest of history, you know, that stuff became fashionable. Now there are reproductions of reproductions of reproductions of the Chernikhov thing. You can have a Chernykh drawing in 15 different colorways and so on. But what a funny thing happened maybe 10, 15 years later, or whenever it was, the first time I went to Berlin, I had actually got slightly bored with Chernikhov, and I'd fallen out of love with the early archigram things. I'd moved on to hedgerows and wobblies and softies and all, which you will see later. And then, for purely whatever reasons, I found myself in Berlin and was taken to see Ludwig Leo's building. For my own personal history, the wrong moment, you know. But the important thing was it didn't matter that it was the wrong moment. You know, suddenly I saw it and I said, my God, it was okay, wasn't it? You know, Chernikhov lives, early archigram, the bright colors, the things on legs, the things that do this and that. My God, maybe it wasn't such a bad idea after all. And I think that's extremely fortuitous. I think that the notion of seeing things at the right time, the wrong time, that recall memories, that recall childish instincts, I think that is very, very good for the system. And I think that therefore it's a good overlay upon the way in which our development of our bullshit of architecture, which tends to work in compartments: love, hate, right, wrong, good, bad, what is architecture, what is not architecture. It's very good to have it knocked on the head by circumstance. And unless you're incredibly po-faced, unless you're incredibly insensitive, however much you may have fallen out of love with a certain set of ideas, when you see it done brilliantly and well, it it not only questions whether you should have fallen in or out of love with it, but it also makes you realize that these pockets are actually related to some ongoing set of values, perhaps. Next. In parallel, I saw a building in Buenos Aires at the wrong time, after I had fallen out of love with shuttered concrete, after I had fallen out of love with rounded corners. Quite a long time after, by this time something like 18 years after. And one happened to be in Buenos Aires and saw this building which one had remembered as a murky photograph in magazines of the 60s. And it did it so brilliantly, but it did other things, that one said, my God, it was great after all. Again, that same thing. My God, what's wrong with rounded corners? What's wrong with shuttered concrete, particularly when the man, Clorindo Testa, makes out of it such spatial magic? He does this brilliant thing with the corner of the street where he drops the eyebrow, cuts the light quality, and makes the three other buildings on the other side of the street become part of his building, etc., etc. And that was extremely gratifying to realize that you could this recall back. And of course it also points to another thing, which is it's extremely difficult to place one's architectural values merely by what can be recorded on flat pages, what can be recorded even in lectures. And in the end you go there and you say, my God, that particular vocabulary of form is able to produce something as beautiful as the highest Gothic. Next. Now another thing is, of course, working with others. I think that all of us who work in schools of architecture try to invent this particular form of bullshit called the architectural school and give it systems and battles and all these sort of ideologies and so on. But probably the best form of architecture school is that which some of you, I hope, will be lucky enough to concoct, which is called your friends. My own view about this is that the difficult first 5 years out of school can be made possible if you have the right friends. It's another tricky thing to say, because we're all supposed to be equal and everybody's nice, and even the untalented and the unbeautiful and the pencils in their feet have a right to exist. But in the end, you can't beat highly talented, viciously talented friends who are brighter than you are, who are more inventive than you are, who are cleverer than you are. And I was particularly lucky and have continued to be in that respect. I think that I only have done what I've done because at one's elbow at a certain point was Mike Webb doing something much, much better, or Ron Heron doing something much, much better. Next two slides. Or David Green doing something much, much better. And it is not a question of copying, but it is somehow a question of that delicate mixture of rivalry and love, and something which Peter Smithson, who was my old teacher, calls the artisan tradition, the tradition by which sort of looking over the shoulder of and watching the way the hand moves, and watching what sort of beer is drunk, or watching what sort of cat sits under the table. It's a mixture of all these strange things. That is actually as useful as any very, very developed curriculum. Much more useful, in fact. And I think that the plug-in city, I'm now looking back at it as an art historian, as it were, as a historian of somebody else's work. Yes, what is interesting is its preoccupation with the rounded corner. What is interesting is its preoccupation with mechanisms. But what actually one has found it more difficult to talk about was that actually secretly at the back of one's mind, one was trying to compete with Louis Kahn in his Philadelphia plan. In fact, and that's harder to explain, but I just leave you with that honest reminisce. Next. The other theory, which is an obvious one, but it's one which I was reluctant at first to even discuss, and have only come over the ground more recently. So the business of being a seaside child. Now, of course, you all live by the seaside here, and that's probably why I've always found Los Angeles so immediately accessible and like familiar. even the first time, it seemed incredibly familiar. It's just a bigger version of what I'd grown up amongst, which was the English seaside. Even the po-faced, uptight, puritanical English do very, very funny things at the seaside. I know, because I was an ice cream seller and used to see it all. And it's not only their behavior, but of course the way in which the town, the type, the generic type of the seaside town is the extension of that. After all, the seaside town has to metamorphose. So little wonder that I became interested myself in the metamorphic city, because I'd grown up amongst the metamorphic city. The town which in the summer has 4 or 5 times the population, which in March or April starts to open up. Pieces of wood get painted. Pieces of wood that are just staying as skeletons start having canvas rolled out upon them. A guy comes along with a row of lights and starts fixing them. You know, things creakily move into operation and start being inhabited. Houses with empty roofs start having people sleeping in them. The thing actually does grow like some sort of moth or something, and absorbs these extra people. And then the cycle moves, and September, October, it creaks back. They unroll back the canvas. They leave the odd thing flapping, but it's creaking back. And there's a certain sort of piquancy, as a matter of fact, to the English seaside town in winter. The other aspect, of course, is the question of a sort of inventiveness which comes in the seaside. Things which are anyhow for a population that isn't going to be quite as discriminate as normal. And also the other tradition, which is what I call the North Sea tradition, which always is the reason why I feel myself so familiar when in places like Gothenburg or Antwerp or whatever, which is that there is a kind of culture surrounding the North Sea which had to deal with winds and waves and weather and strange things being hauled up on ropes out of boats and so on, and led, I think, quite directly to the English preoccupation with engineering, which of course led in its wake to the high-tech preoccupation. But that is a lecture in its own right. Little wonder then that on the slide on the right, the child of the seaside, after those 7 years of expensive architectural education, probably started subconsciously to look back to the seaside and said, we have things that stick out in the sea, you can have things that go on water, why not a village that goes on a hovercraft? Next slide. Sequence of 3, the stages of the hovercraft travelling, the hovercraft extending, and then you'll see it with the balloon over it. Little wonder, because one grew up in a town where there were funny devices that went up and down cliffs, and you pay a penny and you go up, you pay another penny and you go down. And in fact, are they buildings, are they vehicles? It doesn't matter. They're all part of this bits of engineering, bits of tarpaulin, bits of flap, the winds, the waves, and so on. That was probably, next slide, as it happens, a more important vocabulary background. Certainly a vocabulary background. It can be argued whether it was a philosophical background, certainly a vocabulary background, than many of the things that I learned in the 7 years of expensive architectural training. I have forgotten most of my Vanbrugh. I have started to remember most of my tarpaulin. And another juxtaposition of slides, of course, would be to put this one on the left alongside the Chernykh, if you follow me. Next. And I suppose one puts the same demands upon one's students. It's difficult to explain how I can justify that, but instinctively I do. I feel that the last thing I wanted them to do is my architecture. I suppose one from time to time likes to sort of suggest tricks of the trade. But what I'm very interested in, I'm not a regionalist, I don't mean this, but what I am very interested in is how quickly and how vocabulary fulsomely they can look back on their own curious lives and places they come from and places they visit and dogs they see crossing the road, and actually make that into their own form of architecture. I'm always fascinated to see what might come out sideways, as it were. And I'm delighted that some of the authors of the next few slides are actually sitting here in the audience, and they will forgive me if I describe the things as wrongly or whatever the hell. And I've even got a crib because I keep forgetting that the Dagmar Richter, who's sitting here somewhere, as a student made this music project. George Crumb, that's right. That's the music was by George Crumb, and her task was, which I set to many students, was to find an architecture that directly comes from the music, to perhaps set a kind of formal scale for the thing, but for the actual architectonic form to emerge directly from the formation and the spirit and the atmosphere and the delicacy and the transparency or whatever other qualities could be analyzed to it, to make that architecture directly from the music. Or one has been fascinated by such notion, I'm just scattering in the odd student project from Frankfurt, the notion of digging a hole in the ground and then letting the digger become the armature, letting it become effectively a piece of industrial archaeology, which then in effect becomes the architecture. I think one is fascinated, particularly coming from Northern Europe, in the notion of things left after they have been useful, but then taking on another set of values. And of course the seaside is related to this as well. Something which is highly operational in the middle of the season, having other sets of values in disuse. Next. And the author of this project, I know, is sitting in the room. I hope Uli Exner will forgive me if I make a very brief description of it. I think that I'm cynical about contextualism and regionalism. I think there are other areas of bullshit, and you can make lovely bullshits around regionalism and contextualism, but I think creative context, making something positive that is also new out of a contextual situation is what appeals to me about Ollies Tower. Frankfurt's a funny old town, and it has its grim bits and its bourgeois bits, and this particular tower is located between the Bahnhofsviertel, which is a fairly grim downtown area, very hard in the way that only German cities can be, and the old bourgeois villas on the other side. The tower sits between, and the architecture of the tower is made from, as it were, the radiation, almost the absorption of the character of these two faces. I will return to the notion of the Jekyll and Hyde building because it's something that we do ourselves. And here, the Jekyll and the Hyde are the hard face of the tower that looks back to the Bahnhofsviertel and says, I'm even tougher than you are, man. And then the soft side, which looks towards the soft part of the city, the West End with its villas, and riddles itself in the way that the villas and the trees and so on are riddled. I think that way of actually, as it were, mirroring or absorbing. It's like, I suppose it's like many of us would like to be, particularly at parties, sort of somebody with two sets of eyes and mouths who could talk to one of the guests and be talking behind to the other. Now, building can do that, interestingly. Next. I'm lucky enough, therefore, to be sometimes surrounded by contemporaries who are cleverer than I and more resourceful, and students who are sometimes cleverer than I and more resourceful, not all, but many, and my partner who is cleverer than I and more resourceful, Christine Hawley. In the time that I have been doing the project, which I will end with this evening, Way Out West, Christine herself has been producing this project, which is for the London district of Peckham, and making a kind of romantic tech project out of objets trouvés, mainly out of objets trouvés. And that again is something which is very familiar to the person who grew up at the seaside, the use of odd pieces of wood hanging around and odd pieces of tarpaulin and metal and copper sheet and then adding to them just sufficient number of high-tech devices, if you like, to make the thing start to sing. And this is the way to continue in the spirit that one had as a student, by, in a sense, being in direct competition with those closest to you. Next. At the end of this particular thematic thing is the advert spot. We are lucky enough in Frankfurt to have now a gallery called Fenster, meaning window, which that is the window. And because the world is really a very small place, I can say that our first public exhibition was that of the work of Neil Denari, who is also in this room, I think, and can see that we hung his drawings very elegantly. And they're quite safe on their way to Hamburg. And this device is such as having a public gallery in the city, not in the school, but actually out in the city. They're run by us in the school. Is also a sort of excuse to force these concurrences of people. I think that one is lucky as a teacher in being also preoccupied with the idea of exchange and adding to one's group of friends, not always having the same juries, not always having the same language, not always having the same coterie, but using any excuse to get the winds and the circulation of ideas passing through. I don't therefore think that the archigram period was a magic period. I think that there were bits of the 70s that were pretty dreary, by the way, but I think that we are in as just a magic period as then now, if we want it to be. And that might be bullshit too, but it doesn't matter. The bullshit is only useful that you can believe in it. And devices such as the gallery, I'm fascinated by this. It's a little bit of an aside, but I'm fascinated by the sort of archway in which we invent often quite traditional devices in order to perpetuate and intensify the bullshit. We have schools of architecture. We have publications. We have galleries. We have exhibitions. We have models. We have spotlights, etc., etc. We have pamphlets, cards, visiting cards, hats, whatever it might be. I'm fascinated by that because they're totally bullshit. I mean, what should be important is actually the creative act. But I do also know that it is my own frailty too, that unless somebody likes what you're doing, or bothers to hang it on the wall, best of all bothers to build it, after a while you get despondent, and that was the usefulness, I think, of the groups that existed particularly in the 60s, was that there was always at least one person who liked what you were doing, and that might, if the person was good enough, that was all that you needed, one person who you really respect saying, as the English do, it's not so bad. It was great. I mean, that made it. You could carry on there, not so bad. No, hold. This is a funny bit. We switch now from the thing about other people to vegetation. Section on vegetation. The fascination with vegetation started almost sideways on when we made the Monte Carlo project and arrived at the idea that the sort of black box concept might be the answer of hiding the building in the ground and leaving the park on top. At that time, one wasn't interested one jot in ecology or bushes or growies at all. It was simply a device for saying, we will not make a full frontal architecture. We will put the building in the ground and let the park continue. Which was also, and the park aspect was really a very sort of tertiary aspect of the project. Having done that, it sort of nagged one's mind. Next slide. The notion that perhaps you could leave the ground, that you could, if not necessarily bury the building, as was happening there, you could partially bury it. And in the slide on the right, one liked the business of architecture as hint. There's a perfectly ordinary corner of a field and a ditch and a bush, but there's a hint that in the ditch there's something. And in the bush there's something. And in the field there's something. And my God, maybe that something is indicating an architectural activity. Let's say no more than that. The slide on the left, of course, is much more extant. there's a much bigger cleavage in the ground, and one lays a whole rather complicated building into it. There, the stealth is on a different level. Okay, one would walk across the landscape, or track across the landscape, or look across the landscape, and then only when you came upon it would discover that the building lay in the land. So these are sort of stages of overtness. Monte Carlo, totally, is there a word, unovert. The corner hints, beginning to be overt. That overt, but only when you come to it. Next slide. And so in a sense, one's interest in veg as arc, well, vegetation as architecture, came sideways on. By the time we were making the house at the intersection, it was a question of then weaving the vegetational in amongst the quite obviously architectural. Also weaving the historical in amongst the quite overtly modernistic, in the way of weaving the contemplative across the optimistic. One's always been fascinated by the mood of certain architectural creators. Some can only make their best work when they are being extremely kind of heavy about it. Others can only make their best work when they're being extremely jolly about it. And here in the House for the Intersection competition, Chris and I made a building which had to deal with both the optimistic and the heavy and contemplative, and enjoyed cocooning around it and leaving, in a sense, the question, where does the heart of the building lie, for the observer. Next. Next. And coming up with bits of it that were purely, I think, indulgent, such as that on the right. There is a funny tendency, I may have said this in this room before, but it doesn't matter. You've got a new room here now, so I can say it again. There is a tendency, as you trot around the world from igloos to surfboards, that somebody comes up to you. Usually they come up at the end of the lecture when you're actually shattered and you don't want to talk about architecture anymore. And they say, there is a thing just like your thing. Then they always sort of say, it's either there's a thing like your thing up the road, or there was a thing like your thing in 1760. The latter is, I think, supposed to be demoralizing. You know, they say, there was a thing like your thing was done by Otto Schnaub in 1760. And you're supposed, I think there are two ways you can react to that. One is you can say, woe is me, our efforts are in, all our efforts are in vain. Schnaub did it in 1760. What do we do? We have no ideas really at all. Spirited. Or you say, fantastic idea, told you it was a good idea. You know, Schnaub must have been a really good guy. Or they say there's a thing just like your thing up the road, and there are parallel reactions you can have. Well, there was a thing up the road in Karlsruhe, and it was built by the French to keep the Germans out, and the Germans, being very sensible about it, simply went round the side, which always amuses me. And if you can bring yourself to sort of ignore the horrors of war, of course, it's the hardware is great. It's just like our thing. Next. And then the other thing you do is you don't have to be necessarily taken. You can take yourself with you. There's lovely English. I'm in the right place now. If you're showing that slide on the right in Reykjavik, you've got to explain who Green and Green were. But I have to explain what Reykjavik is to you and who Green and Green is to them. You see. The slide on the left, you take yourself with you and you choose your piece of your own culture that you want to. Now one can sort of chortle over the thing on the left, or one can say, my goodness, isn't that really English? Or you can say, in fact, it is the playing out of the normal architectural partie with slightly unusual materials. One can say, yes, there is a piece of neo-rationalist placement of the square window. Climbers would love it. And there is the spandrel panel again, not this time doing that, but simply growing. And my goodness, yes, the classical cornice, celebrated in primroses or whatever it is up there. Why not? It's all bullshit anyway. And you take yourself with you. This is a local slide that many of you will probably know, the thing on the right. Well, or you will know the thing that is on the other side of the road, because I took this about 8 years ago when I came here with the AA students. And there were 35 cameras pointing to the green and greenhouse on the other side of the road. But I saw this thing and I thought, nobody told me. I said, God, there's our thing. And it proves the notion of the house in the hedge. There is the house in the hedge, Pasadena. The house in the hedge. I don't want a pedant to tell me from the back there ain't any house in the hedge. I don't want to know that. For my purposes, there is a house in that hedge, because it's the best hedge I've ever seen that gets nearly to being like a house. And that, I think, there is a certain, I would claim that this is a form of scholarship, or collectivitis, which is to go around the world collecting evidence to support your hunch, or your creative hunch about certain pieces of architecture, and say, if you've been thinking about houses in hedges, what you actually then go out is to find a hedge that, if it is either is a house in the hedge, or could be a house in the hedge, and you've maybe made your point. I don't know whether I'm being a little bit obscure here, but I think that supportive evidence is rather like somebody whispering in your ear and saying, it's not so bad. Next slide. You'll see why I was interested in that slide, because about 3 months earlier I'd done this project, which was about the house in the hedge, or the house behind the hedge. I was preoccupied by hedges. And Pasadena just did the trick. What would have happened to this project had I seen the Pasadena hedge first is another conversation. Next. Next. 2 local examples again. Because what is marvelous about this region is the watering of California. I'm fascinated by these 2 buildings. One, I'm sure earlier in the day there would have been the conversation, which of them is architecture? I like Lloyd Wright stuff because it is just marvelous scenery. I like that particular house. I think it's on Franklin, which has the 2, it reminds me always of the face, the 2 pink cheeks and the lovely mouth. But what's happened is, of course, with the greening of California, is that the hair has straggled over it, but has not destroyed the proposition. It's rather like when you see somebody with, a beautiful face, but there is the hair straggling over. The yashmak notion is fascinating one in architecture anyhow. Or in the case of Pueblo Rivera apartments, it was fascinating that all that time, I think it was 20 years ago when we actually took this slide, and there was an old codger living in that apartment codger is an old timer living in the apartment, who came up with the brochure of the building when built. He'd had the brochure and he'd bought the apartment and moved in and stayed there ever since. And the brochure had this yellow desert, I think with a single palm tree, and then the amazing inventive Pueblo Rivera apartments, rush going across in their kind of almost de steel composition. What had happened to 1969 when that photo was taken was, of course, that the desert had been watered and had crept over the building, yet the powerfulness and the inventiveness of that building had still maintained itself. It didn't matter that it's overgrown and the odd window creaks slightly and the guy was now in carpet slippers, and that the axonometric in the brochure was an abstracted diagram of something that actually lives and is, I think, the more potent, having acquired this patina of time. And that is something which has fascinated me for a long time. So it's not just a romantic attraction towards Groes or towards the metamorphic city or towards the seasons of the year. or towards the vagaries of place and time and dampness. After all, I come from London and we are damp. But that this can actually add certain qualities and can not only quite easily coexist with the best architecture, but in fact seems to exist best with the best architecture. Suggests that perhaps one does not have to see those monuments those heroic monuments of architecture in perfect condition. I'm not so sure when in London they get the old hoses out and start cleaning the stone. You know, I'm not so sure if they reduce Pueblo Rivera apartments back to the diagram. Next. It is therefore little surprise that in my own work one has been fascinated by the cycle of time, the cycle of decay, and of course something a little bit more radical than just the patina, where the patina becomes an organic condition which causes the disintegration and the replacement of the one condition to another. This is 2 slides of what should be a sequence of about 10, where the condition on the left-hand side gradually metamorphoses to the condition on the right-hand side, but in continuum. Next. Continued preoccupation with the idea not only of the vegetation and the deformation and malformation and reformation, but also the idea of the object that is neither exactly animal, mineral or vegetable, that is, in the case on the left, was actually an illustration for Casabella cover on the subject of the secret garden. And I drew what at the time I thought was a sort of recreation of the the old the English children's story of the secret garden, imagining the object that would have been seen through the keyhole to the garden of a place that perhaps could be inhabited, or perhaps could grow, perhaps could bear fruit, or what, that would be this sort of bush come castle, come house, come what, come tree. It's only maybe a year or two after looking at it again, I realized that I was the dreaded 7 years of expensive architectural education actually got in the way, because if you do look at the object, you realize that it is extremely consistent. There's a similarity of these various berries. There is a crowning, hierarchical object. There is an indication of scale, and so on and so forth, that I'd actually fallen into the usual traps, try though I might not to. And perhaps, therefore, the composition on the right is more an admission of the situation. It's actually, as you can recognize, the intersection house used now as a repetitive apartment block with the hedge house in front, and gardens behind, and orchards, and trees that might be trees or might be houses, walls with houses, spooky gardens, boring gardens, and so on, that in fact one was using now, by this time, it's sort of towards the end of my high vegetational period, one is using it as a set of vocabular parts in otherwise fairly normal architectural hierarchies. Next. Did one admit defeat, or had one by this time absorbed it into the mulch of architectural expression? Later still, one has sometimes played around with the idea of taking vocabulary in its own right, of looking at knitting, looking at extrusion. Next. Looking at the mixture of vegetation and extrusion. Looking at the mixture of vegetation with armatures. And that scheme, I think called the Skywalk City, because I was interested in the idea of wafting, things that waft through the breeze. A waft is not as definitive as an occurrence, by the way. By the way, sometimes the titles of the projects are extremely important. You erect the title, and if you keep repeating the title to yourself, it tells you what the thing must do. Anyhow, one did that, and one sort of stored it in one's back pocket. One said, well, it isn't really a coherent scheme as such, but there's some beginnings of thoughts here about substances and layers and so on. And I'll store that, and sometime or other I'll dig it out of the pocket. It will be useful. Next. And I'm sure many of you in this room have heard me talk about the scrambled egg on toast before, which is the kind of methodology of that project, which was the lump architecture used for commercial building. I haven't got the rest of the lumps here, but I did a whole series of lump architecture, because I was interested in the idea, the sort of dégagé notion of the lump. In English, the word lump is quite distinct from the word heap, which is quite distinct from the word pile. If you think about it in a sort of, if you think about the actual meanings of these words, lump is the most dismissive. It's a lump. A heap is prepared, and a pile is quite considerably prepared. A lump is just a lump, just a lump. And I was fascinated by lumpen architecture and arrived at it by a whole series of things. Then I thought, wait a minute, let's think of it as a means, as a piece of vocabulary. Let's see what happens if lump architecture and ornery architecture coexist. And the ornery, represented by the air-conditioned office building there, with the lump thrown over it, and this is where scrambled egg on toast comes, because the toast is the ordinary architecture. And the scrambled egg, you know, that most of us making scrambled egg on toast, we don't really bother where the scrambled egg lands. And the aspects of the scrambled egg, of course, insidiously percolate down in amongst the actual toast. Consequently, this is the proposal for building. Now, sometimes there is another aspect of there is a thing up the road like your thing, which it has to be California to point out the most horrendous aspects of. I was in Santa Cruz some years ago, and an ex-student of mine who was very much into biomorphic architecture had actually done his AA project on biomorphic architecture, found himself in Santa Cruz and said, there's a thing up the road that you must, he didn't say it's like your thing, it was sort of beyond my thing, beyond his thing. He said, there's a thing up the road you must see. And it was a thing called the Tree Circus. I'm not quite sure what's happened to it now, but they were trying to sell it to the San Francisco museum, one of the San Francisco museums. Anyhow, this old guy, some old guy, had bandaged and entwined and splinted and done all sorts of very nasty, strange things to these trees up in Santa Cruz, and it was spooky. But it was more my thing than my thing. I mean, my interest in the combination of veg and arch, my interest in the possibility that natural growth things could be entwined with the architecture, hadn't prepared me for the weirdness of this. And it's the sort of place you really didn't want to be at after 6 o'clock in the evening. And one realizes that one actually has, as it were, cultural limits, you know, that getting between oneself and one's ideals or one's prognostications about mixtures in architecture. There are cultural limits. There are things like the Tree Circus that are so spooky that you say, hold it, no, I don't mean this. I'm not quite sure. Let's go quite that far. This is, again, like seeing the thing out of time context. Very, very useful for the system. Very useful to see where you do not wish to go to. It's rather like my experience is seeing, really for the first time properly, a lot of Gaudi about 4 or 5 months ago. I actually realized that it was not for me. I'd much preferred it in pictures where I could sort of look at it dispassionately on a flat page, but actually seeing it tactilely, there was something distasteful about it. I have to say this. I'm too North European for it. Next. Well, the other thing, of course, is reflections upon one's own cultural background, since I've made a slightly cultural background point. This is an old one, but I think it's time to show it to you again, because it has something to say to Los Angeles, though it was done, I'm not sure it's before I'd ever been or after. It's supposed to be England, and England is really like that, as you well know, and can be interfered with by architects. And could I just have the next slide on the left, please? Not, right, thank you. But it can be interfered with more. Next, on the right, and more, and next on the left, more, and next on the right, more. Once, hold it, no. Back on the right. The only sane guy possibly being that. I'm amazed in Los Angeles you find that amusing. I mean, you have that sort of thing all over the place. But it was again a question of actually letting the process of the drawing push one to the point at which you couldn't stand it anymore. I mean, I couldn't actually stand the 6th drawing. I said, no, there ain't going to be a number 7. It's gone beyond the line. It was tolerable about number 4 or 5. It had gone beyond the line, but one had to see what happened. And you know, about once every 3 years I do a scheme like this, where I set in my head the scenario, and I sort of know what the next drawing is going to do, but I don't know 2 ahead or 3 ahead. It emerges, and sometimes it's like some awful kind of horrible mutation or invention taking you over, dragging you towards its inevitable demise. Next. I'm fascinated by ambiguous conditions, I think. One is still dissatisfied by the proposition of the tabula rasa, or the line or the ground line as point of departure. That's why I think today, where we were dealing with the cliff edge in several of the projects, and one was actually seeing that the building could be put out in space, though supported, that actually the dominance, the terrible sometimes over-dominance of the ground line could be moved beyond. I've been fascinated by this for a long time. And I think that is why, in the end, classical architecture bores me more than Gothic architecture, but I would need more time to explain it. The marsh is fascinating because it is neither land nor is it sea. It is sea that has somehow been forced to acknowledge the presence of land, but not totally. Or it is land that has been forced to acknowledge the presence of water, but not totally. It suggests then, in my mind, organically, an ambiguous situation, and by implication a three-dimensional situation. One tried to extrapolate that quite directly at the slide on the left by suggesting a marshland could then be layered over by pieces of small-scale architecture and meshes and trellises and things for hanging, growing hydroponically and so on off of. And then the buildings arising out of that. Next, at the time, and it was during the period I was doing the Arcadia City, the buildings themselves had other overtones, but if you look at the base of those buildings, there is that marsh, that induced marsh, not only the as-found marsh, but the induced marsh, implying a ground which is a kind of three-dimensional waffle condition, where somewhere, if you went down far enough, you might reach hard land, and somewhere, if you went up high enough, you are actually up in the air. But the ambiguousness of the lower levels is a deliberate ambiguousness. In parallel, of course, the project on the right, which was to do with artificiality. Next. Christine and I, early in our partnership, made a competition for a library in Trondheim. There are a number of Norwegians here this evening. Good evening. We love your city of Trondheim, but it is very gloomy. And it was obvious that the thing to do was to provide some cocoon for that desperate climate, and inside of which there would be the various departments of this large library. Frontality is the issue here as well, that having erected the cocoon, one makes the cocoon translucent, and therefore the passerby is beckoned to look closer. You pass by, in the elevation on the left, you pass by and you see the shadows of the buildings within, and you say, if you want to find more out about it, come in. We'll give you this, we'll tantalize you with these hints of the constituent internal building. But you come in. When you come in, you find that there is a series of buildings, next slide, ranged around an arcade. And only as you move round, and only perhaps if you've been in the building several times, will you really discover the idiosyncrasies of each of those constituent elements. In other words, it is the total opposite of full frontality. And I think it has been that, rather more than other reasons, why the whole postmodern period bored and irritated me, because it was so concerned with the sign and the frontality. You know, that it left nothing to discover. It left nothing to discover in space, and it left nothing to discover in circulation. And more recently, I've realized that projects such as this are of the tradition, perhaps, of the Gothic. If one looks at this cathedral, there is a condition there. One is peeking in, one is glimpsing, one is seeing, what is there beyond? There's something beyond. Let's come and discover it. The light is emanating from another place beyond. What is above? What is round? What is beyond? You keep discovering it. And this is the very opposite of the sort of full frontal expose of the architecture. Next. I just thought that in case you'd forgotten, they do have igloos in Iceland. This is another igloo. Not only do we get the two gays and the Mercedes, now we get a now dead famous Icelandic artist and his horrendous work produced in yet another igloo. So of course this is a sort of Hugo Hoffman type igloo, but they have igloos. You get the point. They have igloos in Iceland. But since we're talking about layering, my favorite example of an architectural proposition is suggested by this slide, in which the beautiful heroic object is filtered by a series of untamable trees, which at the same time have been set up with ruthless Germanic accuracy every X number of meters. And there we have the whole architectural ambiguity, perfect order, but the inability to totally control, acting as a filter to the original beautiful object. These 3-4 conditions, in a sense, each necessary to the other. If the world were fully made up of beautiful original objects, it would be tedious. If the world were fully predictably ordered, it would be equally tedious. If all was free form and idiosyncratic and just letting it all hang out, it would be tedious. And if we could not have the ambiguity of the filtration of one condition, the diffusion of one condition to another condition, it would be tedious. But once you get them all four working together, I think you have magic, and you have a kind of hierarchy of the spirit, not only a hierarchy of the physical order. Next. In Christine's project for the shadow house, which I then jumped in on to produce the model, there is of course in this case, slightly classicized physical order into which shadow-like objects can be placed in distance and distance. But there again, like the library, one comes upon them, though there is a clear system, one comes along them by stealth. One never sees the whole frontal presentation of the objects. Next. And again, there was somebody who came up and said, there's a thing like your thing round the corner down the road. this time at Schwetzingen, near Mannheim, where what fascinates one is not only the mesh proposition, which of course recalls much of our own work at the time, but also the presence of objects glimpsed, not there, but hinted at, glimpsed, available maybe. Next. And what makes from this even this notion of the mesh, the marsh, the three-dimensional surface, the overlay. One begins to layer not just a simple collage of flat objects, but a collage of systems, each of them in a sense three-dimensional. So one uses the shadow house plan as a point of departure, sets up its extensions into arboretum making, into gardening, sets up a counter system of small pavilions, another system of large pavilions, of villas, and then two bitch elements. The one bitch element, which is the water courses falling down the hill. Here they are, the water falling down the hill. But also another bitch element, which is this sort of green strip held in by nets that crawls across the otherwise geometric quality of the layers. And so one needs not only a collage of systems and the possibility that each of those systems has a variety of layerings to it, but occasionally even a collage which allows of the inconsistency of the type by form, that is to say not just geometrical types but completely random, rather like those idiosyncratic branches of the trees in the slide from Darmstadt. Next. The wayward path passing through the otherwise ordered building. The ordered building then fragmenting. Next. Now a series, again, I suppose, of contextual observations. Context. The rule of the game is that from time to time I design a tower project for a city that I know very well. My rule is that I have to have known the city for at least 4 or 5 weeks before I do one. It's about time I did one on LA, I suppose. I've shirked that. I don't know why. I was in Brisbane, Australia, which is a city with a sort of more humid version of your climate. And I'd set the students the project of this foreshore of the river. And then I did the project myself, which is always a dangerous thing to do, but can be amusing. And I was interested in the notion of the tower attached to the downtown. Brisbane has more or less a sort of second-rate American downtown. And my towers had to somehow deal with the climate. And I actually borrowed, quite blatantly, from the tradition of the early 1900s buildings in Brisbane, which were mostly bungalows where the components had been shipped out from England and then they started casting them themselves, mostly made of metal, decking, columns, meshes, nets, verandas, corrugated iron, such things. And one simply piled them up. Okay, I added, in a sense, I interpreted it in my own aesthetic, but one built a series of towers that were really bungalow upon bungalow upon bungalow upon bungalow, with air percolating in between. A very simple proposition. And I hadn't previously lived in a place that had that sort of climate, so I'd never sort of put myself to the task. Next. Or in Oslo, a city I enjoy very much, back to the dark nights and the sheer fascination with light that one has, particularly in the winter months. And I was inspired by the lantern. In some Oslo buildings, particularly around the 1920s, you get these enormous lanterns, which, because they have cheap electricity, can bring much needed light to the situation. And I borrowed these lanterns. And then I thought, my God, there's a connection between these large lanterns and the favoured English tradition of the bay window, the glass bay that you not only light up, but you put yourself inside. So one goes from lantern to bay window, from bay window to the whole apartment being a window, a lantern, from the whole apartment to the whole building being lantern. So one simply gets 4 scales of lantern, the lantern, 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 as the inspiration for this apartment block. Next. Then I took myself to an abstract place. I've been fascinated for years with the analogy between symphonic scoring and town planning. I think that I'm no musician, but I'm fascinated by some symphonic scoring, the way in which patterns of control and counterpoint and introduction of themes and thinning out of melody line and layering and overlayering, all these characteristics of orchestration are very, very analogous in my mind to the possible vagaries of the urbanized scene. If you remember that point I was making about the meshes and layers and the collaging, if you then think of music, the way it uses this very similar system. And on one occasion I thought, let's just take a piece of music. I took one that I didn't know but looked convenient on paper and extrapolated it to a city patterning. Next slide. Which then leads to something that looks like that. Soon afterwards I was in Frankfurt and have always been in contact with, in Frankfurt, with many artists in a city which is building many museums, and put myself for the Frankfurt Tower to the task of a tower that provides studios for the art not only to be shown but to be made. Next. And then in London, because it's damp, one responds to the dampness. London is a damp town, therefore one encourages the dampness up the wall in the form of vegetation, and one encourages the dampness down the wall in the form of vegetation, and one articulates the crevices down which the damp can fall. You just take the characteristics of the city, the bugs in Brisbane, the darkness in Oslo, the damp in London, the art activity in Frankfurt, and you work backwards from that. What will I do for Los Angeles? Jumping now to another city with which we have been playing, a very nice aspect of my work is not only working with Christine, but about every 2 or 3 years, Christine and I work together with Ron Heron, who was my old partner in Archigram and was Christine's teacher for 4 years at the AA. And the three of us, each rather different from the other, we really enjoy these projects that we do together. One of them has been a series of Hamburg projects, the first of which was this series of small piers laid out into the water. Now I made reference earlier on to this North Sea tradition, and it is perhaps no accident that not only did I spend something like 15 years of my youth living by, or even 20 years of my youth living by the seaside or near the seaside. Christine spent, I think, 7 years of her youth living on the seaside, and Ron Heron spent 18 years of his youth living in the London docks. And so we have this waterside background that comes as a natural response, and in combination we therefore made these land piers with bits of floating building. Next slide. And then in the later project developed the land piers into virtually beached aircraft carriers with working parts and bits of seaside tradition, things that flap up, things that can be draped in the summer, and so on. Next. And developed the actual land pier technology and developed the beached aircraft carrier to a type that could climb up the surface of the ground. Again, there's somebody, Robert Thompson, who I think actually worked on this project a bit. So this evening the room is full of people who know some of these drawings rather well. And Lisa, we're going to shortly come to one which you spent some time colouring up. So I have to be careful what I say about some of these things. I have to be accurate. Next. Frankfurt. Since some of you have been hearing about Frankfurt this week. Frankfurt's a funny place. It would like to be about that, and it's actually about that. Next. And it wants desperately to be a proper city. Frankfurt wants desperately to be a world city. It has a world city scale airport, and that's about it. The rest of it's small town stuff. But it wants to be a world city, and it has many of the pieces of apparatus of it, except it's too small. Being a naive person, I sort of march in and say, well, the thing to do is to make it bigger, isn't it? My goodness, no problem there. And but you know, let's do it by stealth. And so one has made this series of propositions for avenues of Hulk buildings, backyard industry, and market gardening. The Hulk is the bit that I'm going to show you. These buildings are not completed in the project. They are made out of cement slurry binding together bits of old car parts and old bits of railway sleepers and crap of various kinds and bits of wire netting. Slung it all together, make it about 1/2 meter thick, stick it up, get the elevator shafts and the fire escape corridors up there, and say, right, okay, let's see who comes along. Next slide. Well, it can be a few sort of hippies that come along and they just dangle enough stuff off it to make it viable. Or it can be a kind of layered screen, sort of Tel Aviv style interpretation. Why not? Next. Or it could be what one thinks of as sort of AA drift architecture. Or it can be Peacock and the Veg. Doesn't really matter. That's the point. Next. But across the river, one got a bit, I wouldn't say more serious, one got a bit more institutional. One said, my goodness, there's this marvelous piece of water called the Westhaven, and they're building all these museums. What they really ought to build is a kind of park as a museum. And then a funny thing happened, which was that I and C.J. Lim, who was helping me, we just got 3 or 4 weeks into this project, and the conditions of the Kawasaki Information City competition came in. And I was reading these and I said to CJ, my God, I said, it's bloody hell, it's like Frankfurt. Hey, hold it, we've got the scheme, we've done it, we've done the scheme. And by turning the drawings upside down, taking off this strip of buildings, which are warehouses in Frankfurt, and eliminating the power station at the end, taking off the power station, changing the warehouses into free-fall audio-visual open network studios, and printing the drawings green instead of blue. Next slide. We produced the Kawasaki Information City Intelligent Plaza, Japanese terminology, not mine, with all its notions about display, things under the water, things under the bushes, information in the trees, getting mum, dad and the kids up into the trellises, dropping down on boats. In other words, one used the scheme twice over. One has the Frankfurt version and the Kawasaki version, which are virtually identical, because in fact the needs of both of those cities are virtually identical. This is my excuse. Next. And I'm not that energetic. You know, if you're onto a good thing, at least you can use it for 2 cities and see which one might bite. And here we have the elevation, now back onto the Frankfurt version of the power station, which is basically a kind of carpet of greenery turned up on end with the events of the museum, really rather like Japanese pavilion. You walk towards the pavilion, you see a certain set of phenomena, you contemplate, you look beyond, and perhaps you climb up further. That is its technique. I suppose this is the first point in my work, and what is it now, about 3 years ago, something like that, 2.5, 3 years ago, where I actually, consciously or subconsciously, had returned to the megastructure. This I can now say. I wasn't liking to say it at the time, but I realized that this is the first time at which I have returned happily, joyously, to the megastructure, though it doesn't quite look like Plug-in City. Next. Have we got a stuck slide? Could I have the next on the right? No. Yes. And it's nice to jump scales and work at another level of intensity too. In this project, Christine and I were asked by some people in a small town near Frankfurt called Langen to make a museum for stained glass. And the main perpetrator of this scheme, Johannes Schreiter, makes pieces of glass that sometimes have this strange mixture of control and threatened fragmentation from within. And isn't it interesting that piece of glass has very much the characteristics of the building itself, seen from above. The control, the potential fragmentation, the judder. You can use this machine well. The judder from within. Next. The north is calm and quiet, and I hope modest. There is just a hint in the center, a beckoning into the building. The requirement, in fact, is for virtually a light-tight box into which the stained glass can be placed and is artificially illuminated. We had some disinclination to this and we insisted upon a certain part of the building where some pieces of glass could be hung in free space with natural light coming through. And so, in fact, the north face is quiet and attending to a small square where there is the old church, the old trees, and the old town hall. And one beckons the public up and into the building. Next. The system of the building. The cellar plan, which starts to tell us something else about the requirements of the building, because this is a small, modest town culture building. But what they also wanted was a beer cellar for the old folks, a youth club, so a beer cellar where the old folks could drink, a youth club where the teenagers could drink, a cafe where the bourgeoisie could drink, and then, for a month a year, a tent to be erected at the back for the town apple wine festival. So in fact, there is this sort of cultural building surrounded by an enormous amount of drinking going on at every level. Next slide. Here we have the youth club with the teenagers drinking and the main entry ramp passing past it, so one climbs up. And if you look at this side elevation, you'll see that something is happening to the building, because the light-tight box begins to melt towards the back into something that is very much more open-mouthed and jolly. Next. In fact, in plan we see the restaurant in the sort of fulsome part of the building, the ramp system winding around and climbing up past the various levels of the light-tight boxes. There is the beer cellar. Next. And in fact, perhaps culture by stealth might be possible. The notion that in the evening all is shut except the cafe. People are brought up towards the cafe, but you leave one piece of stained glass lit, and these people going to have their nice bourgeois glass of wine say, oh, maybe I should see this glass at another time. You hope that they would be indoctrinated into coming. The south side of the building, therefore, is hanging out. The north side is tight and quiet and gentle. The back is voluptuous. Next. And one is fascinated by this Jekyll and Hyde notion of the building. The front bearing to the back. And of course there's a completely different condition at the back. Next. Which is a much looser formation of space. The north side, the quiet square with the church, the town hall, the various shifts of the building being generated by the axis of the town hall, and then another axis which is that of the tent which is erected for the apple wine festival, and this very much looser space on the south. So in fact the one is feeding the other, the tightness, the quietness, the gentleness, the small shift, the back, the openness, the turn, the tent, the drinking, the sun, the dark, the sun. And that's really all there is to it. I don't think they're going to build it, sadly, but it's a scheme which we probably have spent the most time on of most of the things I shall be showing you. Next. There is happily the quotation of a little piece of the building. Some aspects of the south face are now being constructed in Nagoya, in Japan, for a piece of a small piece of mobile building called a yatai, which is being made for this exposition in Nagoya. It's a steel structure with a series of walkways. And next slide, built for drapes, built for the display of fabrics. And in fact, this structure will be cloaked in the fabrics, and you will climb up amongst the fabrics. And it's a little bit of a hint of what the south face of the museum could be. Next. There is, of course, the building now, I think, started in Berlin for the IBA. At last, after 4 years, they've dug the hole and they've got the crane there, and they're starting. And partly some of the internal, it was a building very much designed from the interior, the internal elements very much recalling the proposition here in a Milan Triennale, where I suggested his and hers as hats, as beds, as miniaturized rooms. Next. But also the Jekyll and Hyde aspect. Here we are, this time on the east, this time the Jekyll and Hyde is running east-west as opposed to north-south. The east side surrounded by our neo-rationalist friends. So we said, right, we could be a bit neo-rationalists ourselves. We have a bit of naughty happening around the edges, but we'll play the game. And of course that fits exactly to the bathrooms and bedrooms happening on the eastern side. But on the western side, facing the park, the trees, the setting sun, the family space. Next slide. Deliberately completely different architecture. The voluptuous side is to the west, because that's where everybody gathers in the evening. As I say, that's where the views are, the double height spaces and so on. In that sense, the building, once you have that proposition in your mind, the building designs itself. Next. And one recalls an earlier piece of housing, the blue house of the series of solar houses for Landstuhl, where again the proposition is north-south, the north tight and quiet and merely an essay in bas-relief, and the south voluptuous, gathering the sun. It's again a building that, next slide, effectively designs itself once you accept this Jekyll and Hyde proposition. Next. But Jekyll and Hyde, I think, can happen in another way. I don't know how many of you know this one. I think it was exhibited in Los Angeles at the Corcoran Gallery during the tour of the exhibition of Follies. And the proposition probably derives from one's enjoyment of the funny old English follies that you get, ones like this one at Gunton, where you get these strange objects. You're not quite sure what sort of architecture, they're total bullshit objects. You're not quite sure what the architecture is, whether it's chinoiserie or historical or when it's early use of concrete or what the hell. Here, I took the proposition to be inevitably a small tower with a view of the sea in an English high bourgeois condition. One could imagine the first evening at which the building was completed and the house guests had been invited down to the large house with its terrace. And there was the tower some little way away. And you could imagine those people coming down onto the terrace, Eve driving down and standing on the terrace with their glasses of gin and tonic. Terribly nice, you've got this marvellous, you've got the tower, and I'm sure you get a marvellous view of the sea. But they wouldn't probably bother to come and find out about it. But if they did, next slide, they would realise that as you descended into it and then started to climb, it would become spookier and spookier. Maybe not quite as spooky as the tree circus, but something towards that condition by about here, as the handrails start to twist and the drapes start to drape and these lamps start to just jangle slightly in the wind. And you're surrounded by an incessant blue, a sort of Eve Klein blue around you. It becomes quite horrendous. And then, yes, you climb on and you get a view of the sea. If you want it to be a little white tower with a view of the sea, that's all it is. But the Jekyll and Hyde in this case is the business of bothering to find out. I think that sometimes it's very important to make architecture where the observer has to bother. Maybe that's an arrogant point, but I think it's important. I really get very irritated by the insistence that everything must be obvious, direct, frontal. Next. And this is the last project. Done for Berlin, for the exhibition Modell oder Denkmodell, which was organized by Christian Feireis of the 80s gallery. And I think there are several people sitting in the room who have work in this exhibition. One sitting in the front row, some more sitting further back. So we all know about Modell oder Denkmodell. I took it, we had to do something for Berlin. I'm very cynical about Berlin. I sort of love it and hate it at the same time. I think it's a pompous city. I think it's a city that is still in a curious way resting on the paranoia of its past, and certainly the paranoia of the East and the West. And I took off from this paranoia. I said, right, all these projects always sort of bothering about the wall and Kreuzberg and the Turks and what. Okay, I'm going to be fully hedonistic about it. Let's take the piece I enjoy, Kurfürstendamm. And it peters out at the West End. Let's also think about West Berlin, propped up by the West. You know? Propped up by the West. Let's make it West. Let's say, right, Berlin looking to the West, to New York, to America. Let's give it hasn't got a decent skyscraper, hasn't got a skyscraper. Why not? I know not. Right, let's give it a bit of America, a bit of Americana. Let's take America at full face value. So I tried to do a sort of I.M. Pei, who I always think of as the most American and unmemorable architect. I've seen lots of I.M. Pei buildings and I can't remember any of them. You know, they're infinitely unmemorable. So I tried to do, I thought, right, let's take America, stick it there, the west end of Kurdamm. There it is, bit of high rise, I.M. Pei, bit of middle rise, bit of lower rise, deck, trees. Next slide. Funny place, the site I chose, because it's got this sort of strange lake, the Halensee, and behind it, just behind it, is this strange disused railway yards. Next slide. That is it as found, and one simply puts an American, quasi-American grid. Actually a bit of a funny grid because it starts small and expands in both directions. So it's a sort of a little bit of a playing fun at the preoccupation with grids that both German planning tradition and American planning tradition have. And you can't expect an Englishman to actually sort of really enjoy the grid. You do a grid, but then sort of stretch it both ways, or do it tartan like a Scotsman. You know. Anyway, there it is with the skyscraper, the middle rise and low rise, and just a little bit, by the way, what's happening there? Next. Well, this is where the cactus. What is the West really about? The real West is about the cactus. Huh? Is it animal, mineral, or vegetable? We're told it's vegetable, but do we believe it? I like to think it's soap. I like to think it was where Buckminster Fuller would have gone if he'd been younger. I like to think it's mechanical. I like to think it's Trifid-like. I like to think it's insidious. Not just the scrambled egg sinking down amongst the toast, but the scrambled egg climbing up the side of the toast with intent to rape. Next. Oh, that's it. Well, of course, something is happening because, in fact, there have been these rather tedious generic lines for the grid system. And there have been a couple of other generation points. One there, the most busy piece of street intersection, and one there, the calm little innocuous island, from which one then radiates these radial systems, which are giving some degree of reference, some degree of control to these naughty things happening around the edges. These naughty things climbing up, perhaps, with intent to rape. Next. And there we have the lad himself. Bucky. Secret garden. Soap. Hierarchy. And there he is. But developing. Not just left as some old cactus, but an architectonic cactus. Next. And the whole tower. Borrowing from Uli Exner, sitting here, with the notion of the tower commenting on what appears in plan. If you remember, if you see the physiognomy of the plan, one has some degree of reference to the physiognomy of the plan. In the facade. So in a sense the facade is making that reference, but also developing that reference as a growy. Next. Some detail. A detail of a corner, a piece of typical office accommodation, typical apartment accommodation, and the naughty boy threatening from behind, but things still fairly normal. The old rail tracks, the deck over, the underworld, which is a sort of double-edged comment, the underworld as in sort of Isherwood, or the underworld as in the Weimar years, but also the underworld created as an underworld by the superposition of the deck, ordinary bits of storage, then the things happening at the edges. Much reference, I suppose, to the seaside again. Much reference to those winding paths of greenery. Next. And like the development of the English suburb, one gets to this drawing, because you've noticed the development of the plan, one says, my God, I think we may have gone too far here. And one holds on it, because the cactus has led us to a whole cactus type of building. Next. What I've done, and this is a third finished model, which is still languishing in London because I'm out here on the road, is to re-examine a piece of that and see what happens as the series of drapes are recreated. At this stage, it's only got 2 of the 3 layers on it. It's still looking a bit co-op Himmelblau. Next. And it will look, I hope, the cactus will have overlaid the Wolfie in the next stage. But there it is as it stands at the moment. That as a re-investigation of an earlier stage of that. Maybe one won't take the model as far as that stage. So one's still playing with this, with the organics of this thing. Final slides. Next. as a child, or as a young teenager, I was really wanting to do architecture, and I lived in a seaside town called Bournemouth. And I would take out every book on modern architecture that I could, having grown up amongst old churches and castles and all that stuff we have in England. I knew about that. I wasn't interested in being that sort of architect. I wanted to be a modern architect. And I came upon the picture of Gunnar Asplund's Paradise Restaurant from the Stockholm exhibition of 1930, which of course was pulled down before I was ever born, and I've only ever seen in this sort of spotty photograph. Again, it's a bit like the Pasadena hedge. Now, I have this sort of hunch that perhaps had I really seen it, and had I known more about it, and I've occasionally seen that slightly worrisome photograph taken from the other side, which suggests it's a more ordinary building than I want it to be. But as seen as a 14-year-old, I saw this thing which was totally unlike anything in Bournemouth. It's like an aeroplane, it's like a butterfly, it's like a will-o'-the-wisp, it's about to go, it's fantastic. I still, and I apologize not for this, I still have the same feeling of mystery about it. I still have the same enthusiasm. I have the enthusiasm for what I want it to be, which is this butterfly, aeroplane, will-o'-the-wisp, this almost untouchable, floating possibility of architecture. I feel that architecture can be like that, the same way that I feel that the Pasadena hedge can contain a house, because it so nearly does, and I wish it to. And the proposition, in a sense, is more important than the absolutely authenticized reality. And I still believe in that building. It's marvelous. And in summary, I suppose a very Inglesy kind of view of things, in an Inglesy damp, here we are, a damp place. Marvelous thing about damp and mist is that it then becomes ambiguous. In the foreground, man has controlled the vegetation, certainly. In the middle ground, it appears to be reasonably under control, though beginning to be more untrammeled. But in the distance, who knows? Thank you.
If you want to ask a couple of questions, we'll spend an extra 5 minutes. Or
that's a useful guy. Don't ask me.
I can tell you where the reception is.
I will sing it out in my loud English voice if you like. The reception is at 3958 Ince.
what reception?
Oh, you tell me. The reception.
The reception.
You do this.
In my un-English voice, there's a reception for Peter Cook at a building that Eric Moss did as soon as you get there. It's in Culver City at 3958 Ince Boulevard, which is right off of, you get off the Santa Monica Freeway at Robertson, you go to Washington Boulevard, and you turn left to Ince. I always get lost when I go there. You turn right to Ince. This will be, Dottie has a bunch of them. Okay? Thank you for coming.